have our next monthly meeting in our usual place, the church hall. This is something we've been targeting for a while. Excuse me, the board and Karen so we really want to get back into the live world, but we're not so sure now with this current surge of Omicron. But the speaker for that night, Saul Wiedensaw, one of the reasons we want a live presentation is that he will be in Florida doing presentations at other Audubons. And Margie was able to grab him to come to this particular meeting. So unless his particular programs are canceled, we will be having it at the church hall. And we'll also be doing a hybrid Zoom, by the way. If you don't feel that you want to come to the church hall, we will be Zooming that presentation as well. So you won't miss out. So thanks to Margie for arranging that speaker. It's very exciting. And that's all I have to say right now. Thanks to everybody. Happy New Year to everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to Margie now.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Haney, talking about the Ivory-billed woodpecker as Trickster. But before I give the details of Dr. Haney's impressive background, I'd like to tell you a little bit about getting to the topic of the Ivory-billed woodpecker. At short notice, the previously canceled speaker could not meet the plan, and so I was cruising around about what topic to pick in place, and I happened on Facebook to the topic of the Ivory-billed woodpecker, and I was astonished to find out that there is a great deal of controversy around whether or not this woodpecker is extinct or not. I had no idea. So as I was looking around and trying to learn more, I came across the Mission Ivorybill Facebook page. And I encourage you all, if you want to know more about the Ivory-billed woodpecker and the different points of view, that you consider checking out this Facebook page. It's Mission Ivorybill. And I especially selected this Facebook page, and because the man who runs its name is Matt Courtman. And Matt is actually the person that we all can thank for having our great speaker tonight, Dr. Haney. So Matt is responsible for teaching me a little bit about the Ivory-billed woodpecker. He's an experienced birder, and he assures me he's seen the Ivory-billed woodpecker 2 times since 2019 and heard it 8 times. And he's also been very responsible for speaking up to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I know that Dr. Haney will cover this more, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has wanted to declare this woodpecker extinct. And it's just created havoc among the different factions who say, no, it's not extinct, I've seen it. No, it's definitely extinct. So just today, this gentleman who found Dr. Haney, Matt Courtman, emailed me that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has granted his request for a public hearing regarding the proposed delisting of this Ivory-billed woodpecker. And that the hearing will take place on January 26th this year. And also the period for public comments about, well, should they be declared extinct or not is in progress. So formally, I want to thank Matt Courtman for his understanding in finding us Dr. Haney. And although he personally thinks that the Ivory-bill can be found in the Louisiana woods, but he's very open-minded and made sure that we got a really good speaker who can represent the whole story about the controversy as well as the woodpecker itself. So I'd like to introduce Dr. James Christopher Haney. He's a biologist, conservation scientist, and lifelong birder. For 12 years, he was chief scientist at Defenders of Wildlife. In 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service invited him to lead, which for the time was the largest ever vessel, that is boat survey of marine birds in the Gulf of Mexico, in order to help document the injuries to wildlife that were caused by that horrible Deepwater Horizon blowout and oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Finally, as author, Dr. Haney will reveal to us tonight how and why conservation makes faulty decisions, in that he outlines in detail in his new book called Woody's Last Laugh, how the quote unquote extinct Ivory-billed woodpecker fools us into making 53 thinking errors. So welcome, Dr. Haney. We're so glad that you could join us tonight.
Well, thank you. It is really my pleasure to be here with all of you this evening, wherever you are, in whatever part of the country. I certainly would trade my weather for yours. I don't like cold weather. My lower tolerance for temperature is about 52. So this is a real struggle right now here in Washington, D.C., because we're having sub-freezing weather all week. My title for the presentation tonight is Ivory-billed Woodpecker as Trickster, and I'll explain why. Obviously, the bird itself doesn't know it's tricking us. It's out either really dead or doing its own thing and doesn't care what we think. But I will show you how the bird has tricked us. I'll give you a couple of examples, but we'll also look into our own minds a little bit and see how easy it is for us to be tricked. I have to say from the outset, I was not always interested in Ivory-billed woodpecker. I grew up since I was a very young boy thinking the bird was extinct. My grandfather gave me books at Christmas and for my birthday. Some of them dated from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And almost invariably, they said it was rare or extinct, on the edge of extinction. And because I grew up being mentored by older birders long before I became a scientist, I was sort of inculcated too by them with this belief that the woodpecker was gone. Put it over there in the category of passenger pigeon, Carolina parakeet, didn't really give it much thought. That changed in 2004 and 2005 when a putative Ivory-billed woodpecker was sighted in the big woods of Arkansas. And at first, I just became sort of casually interested in what was going on. There were two things that sort of piqued my interest and eventually held it. One of them was that when I started to hear about what was being described as the biology of the bird in 2004 and 2005, after these sightings in Arkansas, I noticed that they differed, sometimes quite radically, from what I read as a young boy. And that puzzled me. As a scientist, I'm always curious when there's two apparently contradictory stories going on. And so that was just a little puzzle that I engaged in part-time. A couple of the contradictions, though, that I'll give you, one was about the bird's diet, the other one was about its behavior. In particular, the behavior one captivated me because I was reading things about the bird being allegedly half tame when early naturalists, beginning with John James Audubon and going up all the way through the gentlemen who were trying to collect and shoot the bird for their cabinets and museums and for private sales, they described the bird as the most cunning thing that wore feathers, and that they couldn't get closer than 300 or 400 yards to it. So I was trying to reconcile this, but it wasn't much more than just a passing interest. But then I watched people's reaction to the Ivorybill. And those of you who followed the saga from 2004 and 5 about that sighting know that it set off a firestorm of not just controversy, but a firestorm of conflict. Behavior in us as a species that can only be described as bizarre. And I'll give you a couple of examples. On one discussion thread on a bird forum, so somebody starts a topic and then, other people join in on that. Remember, this was the days before Facebook and Twitter. On that one thread, there were 14,000 comments, most of them exceedingly hostile, many of them bullying about people's belief in a still living Ivory-billed woodpecker. And so this seed in my head started to germinate, which was, well, wait, folks, it's just a bird, okay? I mean, it's just a bird. And so I'm a little bit of a contrarian compared to some folks. It's a big black and white red woodpecker. Yeah, it's cool, it's big, it's gaudy, it was neat. But we have another big black and white and red woodpecker already. Yes, it's not the same genus, but we also have similar woodpeckers in the same genus in the tropics, all the way down to the southern South America. So again, just for me personally, I missed not being able to go out and see Carolina parakeet. Wow, our only native parakeet, green, orange, gaudy, made all this screeching sound. That's the bird I missed. And so I was watching all this controversy unfold, people bitterly protesting that the bird was extinct, and others that were insistent that it was alive. And I just could not, for the life of me, figure this out. And I didn't start out to write a book. I was merely trying to pass some time understanding why there were these contradictions. So I went down the road of biology first, and I was able to sort of solve a few small mysteries, but not the main ones. The main mystery of why we act so bat-dung crazy over a bird was still there. And I remembered back in my fellowship days, I had a postdoc that I did at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and I was able to work alongside several economists and social scientists, and they impressed upon me the importance of something called heuristics. These are mental shortcuts that we take when we're pressed for time. And so I started to kind of veer over in the direction of cognitive psychology and science to see if I could make sense of what was going on. And I could. And so I started a journey that ended up taking about 15 years, looking at it, how our mind works, and then going back in history, more than 100 years, to see how and why and where and when we developed all of these notions and ideas about the Ivory-billed woodpecker. That led to a book that was just released last month, December 1st. It's called Woody's Last Laugh: How the Extinct Ivory-billed Woodpecker Tricks Us, or fools us into making more than 50 kinds of thinking errors. And the premise behind the book is pretty simple. It's just that we humans are in the role of Wally Walrus. And I'm dating myself because I grew up watching cartoons of Woody the Woodpecker, and Woody was always pranking Wally. Wally would fall for the same hoodwinks over and over and over again. So that's the kind of, explains the title. We're Wally Walrus, we're the ones getting tricked. The woodpecker isn't even trying to trick us, actually. It's just out there, as I mentioned earlier, doing its own thing. It's either really dead, or if it's alive, it's doing it without our help, and it's doing it in ways that still sort of mess with our heads. And we'll look at some of the ways that it's done that. Here's something, more than anything else, I would like each of you to come away with tonight, learning something or hearing something, seeing or witnessing something you just never heard before. If I can succeed in just giving you one new thing, I will feel like I have had a good night with you. I want to start with saying that the Ivory-bill has long confounded all of us. It goes back to early naturalists who were trying to make sense of the life history, the behavior and ecology, the habits of this bird. And they could never quite get to a consensus. They could never quite agree. We read from a gentleman by the name of Beyer. He said when he went out and studied the bird, or tried to, the accounts of the habits of this species seem to be considerably at variance, meaning I can't find any agreement between people on this bird. A few years later, another naturalist by the name of Hoyt wrote down, I can state some facts that do not agree with other writers. So 100 years ago, people were still finding new things about the woodpecker that they were trying to make sense of. The next quote here is from Allen and Kellogg, two researchers from Cornell University. They had the privilege of studying birds very briefly in North Florida or Central Florida, and they said much the same thing as their predecessors. Some of our observations just aren't at variance with those published by others. Again, so we're still seeing things that don't fit what we've seen written down or spoken. The last one, though, the last quote is really interesting. It was made by Richard Poe, who was the scientist for the National Audubon Society in the 40s. And he is remarking here, after a book has already been published about the only field study ever successfully done for Ivory-billed woodpecker, the only one, and we'll see that here in a second. But after that's done, he says, the Ivory-billed problem puzzles me exceedingly. And I do not feel that Tanner's report, this is the book that I'll refer to in a minute, the study, I do not feel that Tanner's report begins to explain the reasons for the drastic decline in this species. Now, if you know anything about when the Ivorybill is supposed to have gone extinct, most people say it was last credibly reported in World War II in 1944. And so here's a naturalist, though, saying in that same era, I still can't make sense of this. I don't get it. And that's important. Why is it important? Because we already see here about a half century of naturalists saying, this bird puzzles me. I don't feel confident. I don't feel certain. So why are we certain today? The study that Richard Poe was referring to was conducted by a young graduate student by the name of James T. Tanner. The National Audubon Society funded the work. It was the first and only study, field study, extensive study ever done on Ivory-billed woodpecker. It was done in the Singer Tract of Northeast Louisiana. Today, that area is called the Tensaw National Wildlife Refuge. Tanner was able to study birds in this tract that had been long protected and had permanent year-round wardens stationed in that tract to keep away people that might cause any kind of wildlife any mischief. That warden is in the middle, in the central bottom part of this slide, with a young Ivory-billed woodpecker on his head. His name was J.J. Kuhn. He took Mr. Tanner around the Singer Tract, where for 3 years, Jim Tanner followed a single pair. So let me wrap up what this study did. It followed a single pair of birds for 3 years, not different pairs, not other birds, just one pair. It was only done in this one place, this one location, and in that there was only one area where he could consistently find the birds. Other places he might see passing birds or hear them, but he could not follow or track them. Now, whenever we have a science study with a sample size of 1, that's dangerous. Whenever we try to draw conclusions about anything in our world or in the universe with just one sample, it's not just dangerous, it's reckless. But we did it, and we have really, really anchored on that study. So one bias that we're often subject to is called anchoring bias. It's when we get something fixed in our heads and we're just not going to budge from it. I bet none of you know people like that. The problem with the Tanner study is not that it didn't give us good information. It did, and we're lucky to have it, because if we didn't have it, we'd know even less. The problem is not so much with incorrect information from that study, but because it's incomplete. And it violated a cardinal rule of science. You cannot use the same data to generate a hypothesis and confirm it. You just can't do that. That's a no-no. You can take 10 samples and come up with a theory or a hypothesis, park that over here, and then go get 10 more samples and see if your hypothesis stacks up. But we didn't do that. What we did with Ivorybill is we used a sample size of 1 to generate all of our hypotheses about what the bird was like, and then we used the same data to confirm it. And we've done that for 70 years. So it shouldn't be a surprise just on any surprise on first principles to think, hey, we're kind of moving blind here about this bird. I'm going to give you a couple of terms just so we are all on the same page about what they mean. Sometimes they're tossed out there and they're not really clear. When I refer to extinction tonight, I'm referring to the death of all individuals in the species, all of them, not just in one place or two places, but in all places, everywhere, every individual is gone. And how do we evidence extinction? We do it by a couple of things. One, the most important one, is a quantitative survey that repeatedly goes out and doesn't find the animal or plant, and then comes back and says, states the belief in extinction as a probability. We're 90% certain that Bachman's warbler is extinct, or we're 75% certain that some freshwater clam or mussel is extinct. That's the responsible way to do it in science. That is the protocol, that is the standards used by BirdLife International and by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I wished it was the standard used in this country. It's not, but that's what extinction is. There are a couple of other terms I want to emphasize. One is Lazarus species. So these are animals or plants that disappear. They're thought to have gone extinct, and they kind of fall off our perceptual radar, but then they're later discovered to be quite alive. So there's this gap between periods that they're seen and not seen, and that gap can give us the impression that they're dead and gone, but they're not. We're going to look at several birds from around the world if that's been the case. The last is something called cognitive bias. A cognitive bias is a systematic, predictable, and usually unconscious departure from accurate, rational, or logical decisions and perceptions. Cognitive bias doesn't have anything to do with inherent bias. It doesn't have anything to do with how we feel about people of different nationalities, about people of different races, religious beliefs, political ideologies, nothing to do with that. Cognitive bias is found in every single human being on the planet. You can't escape it. And that's actually a fun thing because we can play with it and kind of laugh at ourselves. We don't have to pretend that we're bias-free, at least in this sense. They're always due to shortcuts that we make because we simply just don't have enough time to look at things long enough in order to make the most rational or accurate decisions. So I want to go through this list of birds that were thought to be extinct, but were rediscovered or refound later. We're going to start off with this really beautiful bird. This is called the Gurney's Pitta. It went missing in 1952, but it was rediscovered about 34 years later in 1986. The Gurney's Pitta is a bird found in Thailand and Myanmar. So it was only thought to be extinct for a few decades. This next one is not quite so colorful. It's called the Anti-Akua brush finch. It's found in the Andes of Colombia. It went missing for just a bit shy of 50 years. And it was rediscovered in 2018. This drab little bird here is called the Jordan's Warbler. Jordan's Babbler. It went missing in 1941 during the World War II era, and it was refound 73 years later. And you're going to see a pattern here at increasing time or gap between when it was thought to have gone extinct and when it was rediscovered. The Jordan's Babbler is another species of small bird found in Myanmar, or used to be known as Burma. This is one of my favorite. This is the blue-eyed ground dove. It's found in the Cerrado region of Brazil. It went missing in 1941 as well, but it was found a little bit later, a year later actually. It went missing for 74 years. This next one, another colorful one, and it gave a name to this phenomena of birds or animals or plants gone missing and then rediscovered, and I'll come back to that. It's called the Cebu flower pecker. And it went missing in 1908. It stayed gone almost a little bit more than 80 years. And when it was rediscovered, it was found in a fragment of trees, a little patch of woodland, not much at all. It was thought that Cebu is an island in the Philippines. All the forest was gone, and this bird was certainly extinct, and everyone thought so for 83 years. Eventually, when surveys went out and did a more thorough search, they found the Cebu flower pecker in 3, maybe 4 different locations. So again, this shows us that our perception of nature is not infallible. We can't be everywhere all the time. We're not omniscient. Next one is even more interesting because it was discovered, it's the Demar Flycatcher. It's found on an island in Indonesia, and it was basically discovered at the end of the Victorian era when there were lots of colonialists around the world collecting specimens for their home museum. And it went missing just before the turn of the century in 1900, went missing more than 100 years. But when it was rediscovered, it was found to be not particularly rare. It's just that nobody had ever looked. The island is kind of remote. It's not a particularly conspicuous or large bird. It was obviously not gone. It's just nobody had really bothered to look. This next bird is also interesting. It's called the Bangai Crow. It's also found in Indonesia on the island of Central Sulawesi. And the Bangai Crow went missing also for more than 100 years, a total of 107 actually. And part of the explanation for why it was not detected is it's very similar to another corvid called the slender-billed crow. So why am I emphasizing this? Well, if you have 2 species that look alike, and one's really common and one's really rare, if we're not careful, we can misidentify them, but we can misidentify them in either direction. And if we misidentify the really rare one as the common one, the rare one will go undetected, will go overlooked. And we think that this might have played a role with this bird. The next species is the Indian forest owlet. It went missing for 113 years between 1884 and 1997. It's a tiny bird, drab, nocturnal. Not too much of a surprise as to why that one might be hard to detect. This next bird is called the large-billed reed warbler, rather, the large-billed reed warbler. And oddly enough, it's found in at least 5 countries: India, Thailand, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. But again, it went missing for 139 years. Thought to be gone in 1867, rediscovered about 14 or 15 years ago. This next one is one of my favorites. This is the New Zealand storm petrel, tiny swallow-sized seabird. And 3 individuals were collected in the mid-1850s. And then nothing for 153 years. And the gap was so large that people thought, maybe that wasn't a real species to begin with. We only have 3 of them. We've never been able to find any more. Maybe it was an odd molt sequence, an odd color morph. Maybe it was a different age class of a more common storm petrel. maybe it isn't even real. Well, it was real. It was rediscovered in 2003, and eventually photographs were obtained that convinced the most hardened cynics. And in addition, a few were caught using mist nets or cannon nets used out at sea. Well, here is the odd thing. When the breeding grounds of this rare bird were found, they ended up being about 24, 30 miles away from Auckland, New Zealand's largest metropolitan area. Now think about that. A whole species hid from us near a country's largest city. Maybe we're not as smart and as all-seeing as we think. But the prize, I think, for best hiding ability among birds goes to this one. It's the Bermuda petrel. Not a whole lot smaller than Ivory-billed woodpecker. It went missing in 1620. It was rediscovered in the early 1900s, missing for more than 3 centuries. So a medium-sized seabird managed to hide from us on a very small, densely populated archipelago in open terrain, flying over the open ocean for 300 years. Again, telling us, be careful, we don't know everything. So why, I mentioned, we'll go back and I'll draw your attention to that bird there in the right-hand side middle, the Cebu flower pecker. That bird gave rise to a term called Romeo error. We use the term Romeo error when a species goes missing. We think it's extinct, but then it turns out to be alive. Now, why do we use Romeo error? It's named for the Shakespearean tragedy in which Juliet is in a coma or sleeping in her family crypt. Romeo comes, sees her, thinks she's dead, kills himself. She wakes up, sees that Romeo is dead, then kills herself. So it's a huge tragedy. The reason this kind of mistake in conservation biology is called Romeo error is if we give up on species too soon, if we assume they're dead when they're not, we might forego protections. We may step back, not give an animal the kind of fighting chance or a plant that it needs in order to survive. So that's why it's called Romeo error. And I want to say that we've been committing Romeo error with Ivory-billed woodpecker for more than 100 years. It was claimed to be extinct as early as the 19-teens. And you can read accounts from people who, when they would hear someone report an Ivory-billed woodpecker in the Okefenokee swamp, they would say, "Show us, or we will not believe the king is dead," meaning the king of the woodpeckers. So people had this fixation on death of this bird from a very early time. We've been fixated on its extinction for 100 years. And there are some good explanations for why. It sort of went off our perception, our radars, at the same time that Carolina parakeet went extinct, the same time that passenger pigeon went extinct. The 19-teens were not an optimistic era in American history. We had just come out of the Great War in Europe. The carnage of that destruction and the death of World War I really put a dampers on people's outlook. We'd also just transitioned out of the frontier era. And we were trying to sort of reimagine ourselves as, what does it mean to be an American? You know, we always had this pioneer stuff and the frontier and open space and new places to sort of conquer. Now we don't. And so the Ivory-bill went missing in that era. And it got sort of tethered to these other negative things, including these real extinctions. And it set us up for a kind of trick. This motif where a bird goes extinct, but then it's rediscovered. Goes extinct, is rediscovered. And that has happened to every generation of Americans since the 19-teens. And that kind of phoenix myth sort of pushes the bird away from being a material, real object out there in nature that we can understand with the tools that we have for understanding nature, and pulls it into cultural mythology. And back there at the back of our minds, it's playing these cultural and sociological tricks on us because we have read about this extinct bird for more than 100 years. We're going to switch gears now, and I'm going to participate in an exercise with all of you on how these kinds of errors and mistakes work. So if you have a pen and paper, or if you just have real sharp memory, I want you to try to find the pattern and then come up with a hypothesis for the pattern, a reason for it, an explanation, and then what the next entry in the pattern will be. Let me give you an example. I'm going to give you two colors, red, blue, question mark. So red, blue, question mark. If that were the exercise, your hypothesis might be primary colors. Okay, Chris is talking about primary colors, red, blue. What's the next one? Yellow. That would be a nice hypothesis for the pattern. Might be wrong, but it would be a nice hypothesis. And I want you to do that now. I don't think you'll have to have a pen and paper, but if you have one, maybe it'll help you later to sort of debrief. And we will debrief this. So here's the pattern. When I get to the end of it, I'm going to ask you to come up with a hypothesis, and then we'll guess what's next. Here's the pattern. That's what you know. That's what nature's telling and revealing to you. Now, you come up with a hypothesis to explain this and predict the next. Okay, I'll give you just a few seconds for that. Again, it's 3, 5, 7. What's the hypothesis? What's next? All right, that's what's next. That's what's after that. Now, was it what you expected? Pay attention to how you feel right now. Do you feel satisfied? Do you feel confused? Do you feel puzzled? Do you feel irritated? Any of those are fine. There's no right answer to that. So just you give me whatever you want. All right, now take a look at this pattern. So nature's now giving you just a little bit more information. So maybe this helps and informs you, okay? Take a stab. Maybe you want to revise your hypothesis, maybe not. We're going to get 2 more entries and then we'll stop and debrief. All right, so come up with a hypothesis. What's your prediction for what's next? You ready? Here we go. And so the entire sequence is 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 28, and 4 2/3. Now, if you all know how to use the show of hands, is anybody irritated with me right now? It's okay. If you feel like if you feel hoodwinked or a little irritated, that's perfectly fine. I guess I'm not able. Let me see if I can pull up enough.
I see 3 hands right now.
Okay. So some people are irritated.
Oh, now they're getting more. There's 5 now.
Okay. All right, good. That's good because what those feelings are telling you is that your mind locked on to something and it wanted it to be true. It almost needed to be true because we do not like to hang out in uncertainty. So now I'm going to debrief about what happened here. What happened to us when we got an 11 instead of a 9? I'm going to guess that many of you surmised that the 4th entry in the sequence would be a 9 instead of 11. Okay, some of you did, good. Well, what happened to us there? And by the way, I've done this and I fall to it too. So it's not something that, this is not the teacher here. This is another student who's sharing his experience with you. What happened there is we had an observer expectancy effect. We needed the next number to fit the hypothesis that we had in our head, even if it was unconscious. And that kind of observer expectancy effect is called confirmation bias. There's lots of kinds of confirmation bias, and birders and field ornithologists are full of them, full of them. So that's one. But what happened then? I'm guessing that a few of you mathematical geniuses out there went, oh, okay, I see what Chris is doing. It's not odd increasing numbers, it's increasing prime numbers. Any hands on that, increasing prime numbers?
Yeah, 3. Oh, 6.
Good. So again, now you guys are going to get some brownie points here in a minute for doing that. So and even if you didn't have prime numbers at the beginning of your hypothesis, if you changed them, we'll come back to that. So but what happened to the rest of us when we got that 28? It's like, what? I thought I detected a new pattern and I was expecting 17, the next increasing prime number. Well, what happened there is we fell to something called a congruence bias. We never ever specified enough hypothesis to fit these data to begin with. We could have used the hypothesis of odd numbers, prime numbers, increasing numbers, whole numbers, rational numbers, real numbers. Remember all that high school math now? But we didn't. We didn't. And the fact that we did not use any of these other hypotheses, this is something that scientists are terrible at, not giving enough hypotheses to explain their data the first time, the first go around. So that's a separate kind of bias to observer expectancy effect. Now, what happens when we get to the end and you don't see any pattern at all? And that's when the irritation really sets in. Well, that's not so much a bias as it is a logical fallacy. It's called the illusion of validity. It means this false belief that if we just get more information, just more data, it'll all make sense. That's not the way the universe always works. That's why we have things like chaos and random and stochastic and other explanations for when things don't have pattern. Now, those of you who changed your mind, great. I heard at least some of you did. Some of you changed your hypotheses. Fantastic. Because why is that good? You avoided something called Bayesian conservatism. That's when we get new information, we don't update our beliefs at all or fast enough or enough. And if you changed your notions, expectations, or hypothesis in this little exercise, good for you. Your mind is already open enough to revise what you see in nature, depending on if you get more data. What about those of us who didn't? We fell to something called anchoring bias. We didn't update our beliefs. That's also called a lack of Bayesian caution, but it's an anchoring bias when we stay fixed and rigid on something. Now, another exercise, but this one is for the Ivory-billed woodpecker. Take a look at these 4 images, and I want you to make a decision. You're the Fish and Wildlife Service, you're a university professor, you're your local eBird moderator, you're whoever, and you have to make a decision as to which one of these images is the best depiction, the most accurate, the most reliable for Ivory-billed woodpecker. Now, I am not trying to trick you here. There's no other species that are put in here to try to mess it up. All of these are or were believed to be Ivory-billed woodpecker. So pick one that you think is best, the strongest, the best evidence for an Ivory-billed woodpecker. I'm going to give you a little bit more information to help you out. The one in the upper left is a sketch drawn by an artist who claims he saw the bird. There was no physical evidence other than his head saying he saw it and then drawing it. That's it. The next one is a 1939 photograph. This is actually taken from the Tanner's study in Northeast Louisiana. Also purporting to be Ivory-billed woodpecker. This one was taken by Mr. Tanner's academic mentors and supervisors in Florida in 1924. That little thing sticking out on the left-hand side of the tree in the circle is an Ivory-billed woodpecker. Now, the last one is a video capture of the bird that was seen in Arkansas in 2004 and 2005. Now, a little bit more explanation. Those calibrations that you see there in centimeter were taken after the bird behind the tree flew off. There's more video than just this one image. This is just one frame. And the tree was measured, and then those calibrations were able to be used to sort of estimate the size of this bird that flew off from behind the trunk. And the illustration embedded in that is telling us, or trying to tell us, what the observers saw when they took this accidental image. They didn't actually know they were filming the bird, I don't believe, at the outset, sort of depicting the black and white pattern. So pick any of these, which is best. Let's be honest, none of them are ideal by any means, but which one's best? How many of you picked the upper left-hand corner? Is there any hands there, Margie or Karen or Jean? Anybody pick the upper left-hand corner?
I've got 4, 5.
Okay. All right, good. That's we'll set that aside. Now, did anybody pick the upper right-hand corner? Any hands there?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Good. Okay.
7.
So, yeah.
8.
Again, there's no right answer to this. Well, here's what's interesting. The image in the upper right, because it has measurements and it has something that gives us context and perspective and make it at least, detecting pattern and relative size. Most objectives, if you drew a scientist at random from fisheries biology or a herpetologist or a mammologist, they would go, wait, a picture's not worth anything. I can draw a picture of a unicorn. And most objective biologists would pick the one in the upper right-hand corner. But you know what? That's the one that is most disputed. The one in the upper left is actually taken as evidence of the bird's extinction. Go figure. And I'm putting these up here to illustrate how irrational we are and how illogical we are in almost everything about the Ivory-billed woodpecker. The two photographs at the bottom are not disputed. No one disputes that these were Ivory-billed woodpeckers. No one. But you know what? They would never even become close to being adequate evidence for a living bird today.
Mhm.
I'm going to gloss over this because I've already said basically what I need to say, that the Eckleberry painting was just a sketch of a bird he claimed to have seen. And that relies on an appeal to authority based on someone's perceived reputation, not on evidence, but on their perceived reputation. When the story gets repeated constantly, and it has, you can read any newspaper or magazine or journal article about Ivoryville, they'll invariably refer to last credibly seen in the World War II era. And it's referring to this picture. That's it. And that's called an availability cascade. And then when we all jump and repeat the story, we're falling to something called the bandwagon fallacy. I'm going to close out here real quickly with some other conundrums that the Ivory-billed triggers in us. We're demanded to consider that most sighting reports of Ivory-billed woodpeckers since the World War II era, or all of them, were people confusing pileated for Ivory-bill, or they were just out there with wishful thinking. But here's a mystery. Why does the similarity in these two birds only run in one direction? We're demanded to assume that people mistake pileated for Ivory-bill. But if they're so much alike, where are the warnings about confusing Ivory-bill for pileated? They're not there. So try to rationalize this with a logical argument. I'll give you a hint. You can't. If they're alike, they're alike. You can confuse them either way, but we only allow ourselves to get confused in one direction. That's not logical. The theory behind citing reports of Ivory-billed woodpecker since World War II are that birders and other people are going out there filled with these observer expectancy effects, wishful thinking. Maybe they're not lying, that they're just prone to exaggeration. They see pileated, but they're not, or they see pileated, confuse them with Ivorybill. In other words, they're suggestible. Now, there's a problem with this hypothesis because first of all, there's 100 sighting reports of Ivory-billed woodpecker since World War II, 100. And the Arkansas thing only counts as one, not, there were 12 people, I think, who saw the bird claimed to be an Ivory-bill, but that doesn't count 12 times. We're talking about 100 incidents of these, all of which you can find in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's 2010 recovery plan document, easily findable online. So what's going on here? Let's test this belief that everybody's just going out and mistakenly seeing something else, not seeing really an Ivorybill because it's dead. We know it's dead. So what's going on? Well, the problem with the hypothesis of observer expectancy effect is that many of the reports that were made didn't come from birders. They came from, I know one of a fundamentalist pastor, another from a squirrel hunter, another from a turkey hunter, wildlife biologists surveying waterfowl from planes and seeing them below. A lot of people weren't birders and they weren't looking for the bird to begin with. Okay, so that's doesn't stack up with this belief that everyone's just being suggestible. There's another problem with this explanation for 100 sighting reports of Ivorybill since 1940s. If you're an impetuous person and you just, oh, I want this on my life list, I'm going to go out there, ooh, there's a pileated, boom, Ivorybill, put it on my list. Or maybe you don't even need a woodpecker. One person said a crow with sunlight on the wings can look pretty good. Oop, there it is, Ivory-billed woodpecker, right? The problem is that some of the people who have been looking have gone years and years and years and decades, and they're still looking. So why do impetuous people have to wait that long to show their inner lack of patience? Makes no sense. You don't need to wait 2 decades to show that you're rash. You can go out an afternoon and do it. Again, doesn't fit our hypothesis that everybody is just making stuff up. But there's a big problem because when we say that everybody out there, that person, that all 100 or more made mistakes and they're filled with wishful thinking, we fall to something called ultimate attribution error, meaning that we believe we can peer inside their intentions and actually know what their motive was. And we can't. We simply can't do that as human beings. It's called the illusion of transparency. We're all guilty of that in our human relationships. So if we have this belief that everybody's messing up, we're falling to another cognitive mistake with the hypothesis. So we've got to be careful with that. That doesn't make any sense. But here's kind of the take home. After 100 years of saying that this bird is dead, we're a lot more vulnerable to negativity bias. We are not optimistic. If we have an optimistic and a pessimistic choice, the pessimistic one will have more hold on our unconscious. And death is much more powerful than life. So we've been anchored on the negative aspect. We expect the bird to be dead. So imagine if the bird was really there and someone goes out and sees it. Can you imagine what their brain has to process? This belief, this is what I'm seeing, but it can't be what I'm seeing. And that is an indication that a person is in cognitive dissonance, is wrestling with something that doesn't fit their tightly held beliefs. And you can read about this in people who have seen Ivory-billed woodpecker. Some of them break down in tears. Some of them look like they're in shock, in trauma. The last, where I'm going to close with this, is we're not actually more likely to over-report a dead bird. We're more likely to under-report it. And I'm going to save that for questions because I want to give ample time for the rest of all of you about why the bias runs in the direction of underreporting, not over-reporting the bird. And it's another thing that doesn't fit. And if you would like to know more about this, I'll make this presentation available to the Audubon Society. If you want a PDF of it, I can post it myself, or if somebody has a means of distributing it to you, like on a website or something. And if you want to read more about how the Ivory-billed woodpecker has messed with our heads, you can read my book. It's available on Amazon and with a publisher in the United Kingdom called John Hunt Publishing. And it will tell you the history of the Ivory-bill beginning in the 1800s and how the bird has played with us for well more than 100 years. Thank you, and I'll take questions.
Okay, great. Want to lead us, Margie, in the Q&A? You're muted at the moment.
I said, wow. So far, Chris, we only have one question and I'm blocking you to.
I see it. I see
Okay,
it.
you can see it. Good.
Yeah, it's a question from Kay, and she's asking, is it possible that the missing birds had moved, or the population had decreased and then moved again or expanded back into the more populated areas? That's not likely. In some cases, well, first of all, many of the missing birds that were gone for decades or 100 years or more, they're still rare. They haven't gotten common. They're maybe slightly more common. In the case of the Bermuda petrel, it probably it could have fallen to single digits, high single digits or low tens. And now it's up into the low hundreds, even after, now almost 400 years. And so some of them are still rare, but others are not so much rare, but local. And if they're only found in small areas and people don't visit there, or biologists don't visit, local people might be aware of them, but scientists might not. So range movements or big population swings, ups or downs, don't really explain this pattern. The pattern is best explained by us thinking that we're infallible, thinking that we're omniscient and know everything, and we don't.
Okay.
And conservation biology had to learn this lesson. Oh, by the way, there are about 400 cases of Romeo error in the vertebrates. So reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals. It's not rare. It's a really common mistake to think that something's extinct, and it's not. And here's another thing. Right now, we're involved with this U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decision is well, we can't prove that it's alive. I'm sorry, that's not the way we do things. It isn't life that has to be proven, it's death. I don't think that my Uncle Bob is dead because I haven't heard from him in 13 years. I wait until a coroner pronounces him dead, a physician attending his last minutes, or 5 or 10 or 20 family members say the funeral is next Thursday. I don't assume that he's dead, but we do with animals, and that's weird. That's odd. That's strange. That's all here.
Hmm.
And so the burden of proof is not a constant show of proof of life. The burden of proof is to show a bird is extinct, or a plant is extinct, or a clam or a mussel or whatever. We don't have, look, and it's also a silly exercise in hypothesis testing for science. Would I be able to publish papers if I went out and said, oh, I found grizzly bear, I found American robin, it's still alive? No. And I'm going to tell you something. If you don't believe anything else I've said tonight, and you're a diehard skeptic, there is a whale called the spade-toothed beak whale. It has only been documented to science 4 times in 150 years. The first 2 were nothing but skull fragments. The next one was a few years back when 2 animals, a mother and a calf, washed up on a New Zealand beach. Guess what? This mammal has never been seen alive in its native habitat, ever. No one. But we don't believe that it's extinct. So why do we think the Ivorybill is? After 100 sighting reports. And again, I don't have a good answer for you. I wish I did.
So go ahead.
Maureen asks, are there birders who are dedicated to trying to find Ivorybill? Yes, there are. I know of at least 6 teams, and I don't think they're all in Louisiana. They're in more than one state. And I don't know how many states, but I know of at least 5 or 6 different teams. What's considered the best quality information on the Ivory-billed woodpecker? I would read, there are probably, I could list 6 or 7 books. Tanner's monograph is really good. Let me see. It's a little too far to reach. There are several. The Ghost Bird, The Grail Bird by Tim Gallagher is good.
The Lord God Bird.
Yeah, The Lord God Bird. In Search of Ivory-billed Woodpecker by Jerome Jackson. The Travails of Two Woodpeckers by Snyder and colleagues. And my book, my book is jam-packed, and it has a lot of information no other books do. One searcher called it the best book since Tanner's monograph in 1939. It may be as good as that. So that's maybe a little hyperbole, but I'm just quoting him. But you could find a lot of plenty of. There's at least 8 or 9 books now about the Ivorybill, and some of them are quite old. But I would urge you to go back and look at some of the old, what the naturalists were saying in the late 1800s and early 1900s. One of them described the bird as sagacious, meaning it was really tricky and hard to get near. One person said, I saw 8, but I couldn't get a shot off because they were too far away. And there were certain personalities that claimed the bird is half tame, and they made a big splash by going out there in 2004, 5, 6, and 7 and saying, hey, this bird's tame. If it was there, we'd see it. And you can't stack that up with what these early naturalists were saying, 100 years ago.
So Dr. Haney, somebody asked, have you seen the bird? And that's the first thing I asked you when we talked on the telephone.
No, I haven't. The closest I've come to it is I give this story in the book where I'm working in an elementary school and high school. I work after school, and I'm a shy kid, and you know how the awkward ages of 13 and 14 and this, you just want to crawl under a rock and hide until you're 20. Well, one of my mother's colleagues came down the hall, and she knew I was interested in birds. She said, her name was Diane Tennant. She was from Southern Alabama. And she said, hey, Chris, you'd really like coming down to my parents' place. They're sort of estate in Southern Alabama. And I'm like, oh. I didn't want to talk to anybody in those days. The idea of taking a trip somewhere with someone I barely knew, that was just not going to happen. But, I was curious. And she said, oh, we have lots of cool birds. We have white herons and ospreys and this. And of course, in the book, I asked her about fish crow because I just wanted to see a fish crow and an anhinga. I was hoping she'd mention those too. And she'd mentioned the fish crow, but not the anhinga. So I'm kind of deflated. And then she says, oh, and we have the big woodpeckers too. I think you'd like those. And I went, pileated woodpecker. And she goes, oh yeah, we have lots of those, but we see the Ivorybill too. They're more common in the swamp woods, and they don't come as close to the house. And this is in the 1970s. And so I've talked to, I don't know, probably close to 10 people who have seen the bird, or I'm going to be fair. I'm going to say who claim to have seen the bird. And I honestly, I do not question anyone's sightings. I just don't do that. I don't referee them. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. And I, you know, if I ever have some golden years and I'm in good health and I have, you know, a few free months, I probably get in a canoe and look somewhere, but I've not looked. I've not even tried. And it's just because I've had other projects at the end of my time. It's not because I believe or don't believe. Let's see, what's the advantage of an agency declaring extinct? Less paperwork. If you write it off and it's gone, you say it's gone. But, you know, I laughed when I heard the Fish and Wildlife Service make this decision. I go, well, okay, we've been saying this for 100 years. Why are they right this time? Why are we right this time? If the bird survived, it's done it without our help. And so it's kind of hard to make the argument that it's just desperate for us to come in and ride to the rescue. Because, you know, if it made it, it probably made it to spite us, not because we gave it help, but because it managed to dodge all of the arrows that we slung at it. Other than, I mean, my biggest fear is that it's taken off the endangered species list and the migratory bird treaty list such that it would no longer be illegal to shoot one if there were any alive. And I don't know. I hold the prospect that the bird could be gone. It's not possible to tell if one is seen if that's the last one. We've never had good numbers, not ever. And the kinds of things that I need as a scientist to inform me about its prospects, that information's not there. And so I camp out and saying, I don't know. I don't know. I'm comfortable with that. Maybe there's a part of me that likes mystery but after 15 years, if I was like 95% certain that the bird was extinct, after 15 years of research into the bird and into our heads, that needle has moved away from my certainty on extinction. But it didn't go all the way over to certainty about survival. It's somewhere in the middle. And in full disclosure, someone's asked me, well, to put you on the spot, you got to pick. And I answer that question like this. If I could have perfect knowledge and I could learn to this evening for certain whether there were still birds or they were all dead, which one of those would surprise me more? And I believe the one that would surprise me more is that they're all dead, but not much. It might be kind of like 55-45 or 48-52. It's a little bit better than 50-50, but not much. Much more questions. I've heard their favorite habitat is swampland. Well, maybe. We know from past accounts it used other kinds of woods. In fact, I list all the kinds of trees and woodlands that this bird was reported from, and it ranges from mangroves and palms to upland pine forest. So it could have used swamps because those are harder to get around, and it might have been easier to evade humans there. Who knows? Is declaring it extinct freeing up land use in target areas? Probably not that much. I can't point to anything really dire other than withdrawing protections of shot birds. That's the one that it keeps me up. Because that was the proof exacted by earlier claims of extinction. People that know it's still there, I can bring you a dead one, and somebody would give them a permit and they go out and bring a dead one in. So, you know, we don't want to do that, but I'm not sure it would make a whole lot of difference in land use. What was my conclusion after reading Noel Snyder's book? Well, Noel Snyder's book leaned away from habitat as the reason the Ivorybill declined, that it needed these wilderness, old growth forests and bottomland hardwoods. And it leaned more towards direct killing as the reason for the bird's demise. And I've probably moved away from habitat more towards that as an important factor in the Ivorybill's fate, whatever that is. I moved away from being anchored only on habitat to, I think, more faithfully or realistically include direct killing. The problem with the direct killing hypothesis is that the best study of them came 40 or 50 years after the direct killing stuff pretty much stopped. And so it doesn't line up this way. And in time, it doesn't line up well. But the other thing is, if the bird was tame, like Carolina parakeet, you'd shoot one Carolina parakeet out of the flock would come back and go, what's wrong with Bill here? And and then you could shoot him again and again and again. In fact, this is exactly what Chapman did. You can read about his experience in killing multiple Carolina parakeets this way. The Ivorybill, though, shows habits historically that it was wary and that it could learn. Now, young birds would have been naive and easier to shoot, but I got to take these people that were out there trying to kill it at their word and say it was so difficult to do. So I don't think direct killing is enough of an explanation. I honestly don't know. One of the ideas in my book is the Ivorybill was a Pleistocene relic. It might have been adapted to habitats that are just not there anymore. It was adapted to some kind of woodland or features in the inter-ice age era. And, it's different. It was adapted to something that's no longer there. And I don't know how to separate those because we've never been able to study this bird with any good numbers. Again, if you like mystery, this is your bird.
Certainly is. I can't thank you enough. Your talk was not only fascinating about the Ivory-billed woodpecker, but also about how we look at birds or animals or nature or ourselves. So I thank you so much. And here we have.
Yeah, this is the Australia's Ivorybill. It's the night parrot. It went off their radar screen in the late 1800s, and it taunted, tricked, hoodwinked, and frustrated them for a long time. The interval between universally accepted sightings was about the same interval between video evidence in this country. Now the night parrot is known from several places, but it's still exceedingly difficult to see or find. In fact, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia not all of them anyway, didn't know this bird. They didn't even know it was there. And they said, oh, the scientists that were studying the parrot would say, they speak to the elders of the Aboriginal peoples, and they say, oh yeah, we heard that, but we thought it was an evil spirit noise. So they didn't associate it with a living creature, an animal that was nocturnal, rare, and nomadic. They gave it these magical, mystical properties. And that's the problem with the Ivorybill. The Ivorybill triggers our heads to go in this magical, mystical direction as well. And of course, it's a real bird, dead or alive. It's a real bird. It's not unicorn. It's not Sasquatch. It's not Loch Ness Monster. It's a real bird, dead or alive. But because it tricks us, it flirts with our heads, it messes with our heads, it goes into the same headspace that we process magical or mysterious things. And that's why we give it all of this power over us.
That's great. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Really fascinating. Well, thank you so much. I encourage everybody to consider buying your book, Woody's Last Laugh, to get more detail. And you might want to look at Matt Courtman's Mission Ivorybill to learn about other experts. Chris was one of the experts who Matt featured for a full-length hour, as we've done. And I understand that Matt is starting a training to take people out into his part of Louisiana. And I'm not sure I have the time to go that far into Louisiana, but I am actually thinking to play hooky and do it anyway.
Well, that's, yeah, I know that some of their videos have featured, ideas and protocols on how to use, but I've been impressed with that group because they're constantly open to new ideas and to rethinking things. I have to say, I'm been pleasantly surprised that I find that I don't want to call them amateurs because I think it takes a certain kind of professionalism to do what they're doing. But I've seen much more rigid minds among my scientific colleagues than I do in field searchers. And frankly, most birders, there's been a little bit of work that said most of us are comfortable saying maybe, possibly, probably, but we don't have to go to certainty either direction. But there is a cadre of birding that insists that the bird is extinct. And if you don't doubt that, pick up a National Geographic field guide and read it. It tells you that it's dead and also that you're wishful thinking if you see it.
And if you try to say you actually saw one, you might be blackballed from your entire birder community on eBird forever. So it would be very safe to not say anything.
Correct. And that's why it's underreported, because who needs that?
Yeah, you
Who
don't want
wants-
people chasing you around your house and on your computer. Well,
No,
thank
and
you.
if if they're really birds there, you might want to keep quiet to protect the birds.
Amen.
Mhm.
Well,
I
thank
want-
you. Go ahead, Jean.
No, I just really, what a wonderful program it was. It's given us all some really wonderful things to think about. And Chris, if you ever go looking for that bird, please let us know. Please let us know what you find.
You need to go out. I'll tell you who I would go out in the field with. I would go out in the field with Matt or
Yes.
Well, there you go. That's your mission now. After you come back from this southern Indian Ocean,
Okay.
that's a project for you.
Chris, I'll meet you. I'll pick you up at the airport. I want somebody who's got a good perspective like you do.
Well, I could, the one thing I might have going for me in Louisiana is I am from Tennessee, so I can pull out the Tennessee accent when and where it's required.
There you go. Thank you so much for the wonderful program and lots of
you.
good luck
You're welcome.
on your next voyage. And maybe you'll come back and tell us about what you found there too.
Hopefully penguins and albatrosses.
Okay, very good.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for tuning in to this
Can
wonderful,
we just-
wonderful program.
Can we just remind everybody that Scott Weidensaw will be coming. He's committed. He's bought his plane ticket and his rent-a-car, and he'll be speaking at Sanibel and here at Sarasota Audubon. At this point, he'll be speaking really to a mixed audience. In other words, you could access him through Sarasota Audubon on Zoom or live in person and bring a copy of his book to get autographed. He may have books to be autographed with him. And it will be Valentine's Day. So please keep this in mind. He's like our wonderful speaker tonight. He's a highlight for the year. So we would really like you all to watch on Zoom or in person. And we look forward to seeing you next month, February 14th. Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna end it now. Thank you,
Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Haney, and good night, everyone.
Do you want me to make available a PDF of tonight's talk
Yes.
for you?
That would be
Okay.
awesome. And
That'd be lovely.
we will also post this recording on our YouTube channel. So I
Okay.
can send you that link as well. You can share with friends who might have missed it.
Great.
Yes.
I'll just make access to the PDF to one of you, and I assume
Yeah.
that it'll be too big to attach, but I can do a Google share or something.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. We have a Google Drive, so we can make it available to our
Okay.
members. So
Thank you.
I'll
Good night,
probably-
everybody.
All right. Good night.
all
Good
right,
night.
good night.